Emma had always prided herself on the warmth of her home. It was the kind of house where friends dropped by unannounced, where the scent of freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air long after breakfast, and where Sunday dinners with family were a sacred tradition. Tonight was supposed to be one of those evenings. Just a simple dinner with her sister Claire, catching up over a homemade meal while Daniel finished up work in his office upstairs. She had married Daniel 6 years ago, and for the most part their life together had been steady. He was reliable, responsible, and, though not the most affectionate husband, he had never given her a reason to doubt his love. They had their share of disagreements, as all couples did, but nothing that ever made her question the foundation of their marriage. She had always assumed they were a team, facing life together. Yeah. Claire, on the other hand, had never fully warmed up to Daniel. She wasn't openly hostile toward him, but Emma had noticed how her sister would keep a polite but guarded distance. "There's just something off about him," Claire had admitted once over a glass of wine. "I can't put my finger on it, but sometimes he feels cold." Emma had laughed it off at the time, chalking it up to Claire's overprotectiveness, but now, standing in the kitchen, unaware that their evening was about to take a dark turn, she wished she had taken her sister's instincts more seriously. The two women moved around the kitchen with the ease of familiarity. Emma chopped fresh basil, while Claire stirred a pot of simmering tomato sauce on the stove. The kitchen was filled with the comforting sounds of bubbling sauce, the rhythmic tap of the knife against the cutting board, and the occasional burst of laughter. "You know," Claire said, tasting the sauce with a wooden spoon, "I think this might actually be the best thing I've ever made." Emma smirked. "I don't know. That's a pretty bold statement. Have you forgotten about the lasagna you made last Christmas? The one that made Mom cry happy tears?" Claire waved a dismissive hand. "Beginner's luck. This, though? This is next-level culinary greatness." Emma was about to respond when a faint noise caught her attention. It was a distant murmur, almost too quiet to notice, but something about it made her pause. She glanced around the kitchen, trying to place the sound. "Did you hear that?" she asked, lowering her knife. Claire frowned. "Hear what?" Emma wiped her hands on a dish towel and walked toward the counter where her phone rested. She picked it up, noticing that the baby monitor app was open on the screen. It was a habit she hadn't yet broken, keeping the monitor active even though their son, Oliver, was spending the night at her parents' house. The monitor was still placed in the kitchen out of convenience, but it also had a receiver in Daniel's office. She turned up the volume slightly. That's when she heard it clearly. A voice, low, serious, and unmistakably Daniel's. Her heart skipped a beat. He was on the phone, but something about his tone sent a chill down her spine. It wasn't the usual casual work conversation. There was an urgency to it. Emma motioned for Claire to be quiet and held up a finger as she brought the phone closer to her ear. "Yes, tonight. It has to be tonight." Emma's fingers tightened around the phone. There was a pause. She could hear Daniel breathing, could hear the faint creak of his chair as he shifted. "I don't care about the risk, I just need to make sure she eats it. Once it's done, everything will be taken care of." The room around her blurred. For a moment, all she could hear was the pounding of her own heartbeat. Claire gave her a questioning look, but Emma couldn't speak. She couldn't move. "You understand what's at stake," Daniel continued. "I can't afford for anything to go wrong. This is the only way." Emma felt her knees weaken. She pressed a hand to the counter to steady herself. The only way? What was he talking about? Who was he talking to? Claire's concerned whisper broke through her haze. "Emma, what is it?" Emma slowly turned the phone so Claire could see the screen. The app was still open, still picking up Daniel's voice from the baby monitor in his office. Claire's eyes widened as she listened. "I already mixed it in. Once she eats, it'll be over in minutes." Emma barely registered the sound of Claire's sharp intake of breath. Her mind was racing, trying to grasp what she was hearing. This had to be some kind of misunderstanding. Maybe he was talking about something else, something harmless. Maybe. Then Daniel said something that made the floor drop out from under her. She won't even taste it. Emma felt like she couldn't breathe. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a coincidence. Daniel was talking about poisoning her. The air in the kitchen suddenly felt suffocating. The warm glow of the overhead lights now seemed harsh and unwelcoming. She felt like she had stepped into a nightmare, one where her own husband, the man she had trusted, lived with, slept beside, was plotting to kill her. Claire, ever the quick thinker, grabbed Emma's arm and whispered urgently, "We need to act normal." Emma could barely nod. Her hands were shaking, her vision swimming, but she forced herself to move. She turned down the volume on the phone and set it back on the counter as if nothing had happened. "What do we do?" she whispered back. Claire's jaw tightened. "First, we don't eat a damn thing." Emma swallowed hard, glancing at the pot of sauce, the freshly baked bread, the plates waiting to be filled. How long had he been planning this? How had she not seen the signs? She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. They needed a plan, but more than anything, they needed to survive the night. Emma's mind raced as she tried to process what she had just heard. The words kept echoing in her head, each one a nail in the coffin of the life she thought she had. She won't even taste it. Her husband, the man she had trusted, loved, and built a life with, had just admitted to poisoning her. The food sitting innocently on the counter, the meal she had so carefully prepared, could be her last if she wasn't careful. Claire's grip on her arm tightened, anchoring her back to the present. Her sister's face was pale but composed. She had always been the more level-headed one in emergencies, and right now, Emma needed that more than ever. "We need to act normal," Claire whispered again, her voice barely audible over the bubbling pot of sauce. "If he suspects anything, he might change his plan. We need to be smart." "Ah." Emma swallowed hard and nodded. Her hands trembled as she reached for a dish towel, pretending to wipe her hands as if nothing was wrong. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to steady her breathing. "We can't eat anything," she murmured, keeping her eyes on the food so Daniel wouldn't see the fear in them if he suddenly walked in. Claire's mind was already working ahead. "We'll swap the plates. Make sure he eats whatever he tampered with." Emma's stomach churned at the thought. She had no desire to play a deadly game of deception, but she also knew they couldn't just sit there and let him get away with this. "We need proof," Claire added. "If we call the police now without any evidence, he could talk his way out of it. He could say we misunderstood. We need to catch him in the act." Emma knew she was right, but the thought of sitting at the same table as Daniel, pretending everything was fine, made her skin crawl. Before she could say anything else, they heard footsteps on the stairs. Claire quickly turned back to the stove, stirring the sauce as if nothing had happened. Emma forced herself to grab a plate and begin dishing out the food. Daniel walked into the kitchen, his expression unreadable. His dark eyes swept over the scene, pausing for a fraction of a second on Emma's face. "Smells great," he said casually, moving to the sink to wash his hands. Emma forced a smile. "I hope so. Claire thinks she's outdone herself this time." Claire gave a short laugh. "You'll have to be the judge of that." Emma's heart pounded so hard she was sure he could hear it. She kept her hands steady as she carefully plated the food. When she reached for Daniel's dish, she hesitated for only a split second before swapping it with the one she had originally set aside for herself. If he noticed, he didn't say anything. "Wine?" Daniel asked, reaching for the bottle on the counter. Emma hesitated. Drinking would dull her senses and she needed to stay sharp, but refusing might make him suspicious. "Just a little," she said, watching as he poured 3 glasses. She made a mental note to take only small sips. As they moved to the dining table, Emma felt like she was walking toward her own execution. She sat down, forcing herself to smile as Daniel took the seat across from her. Claire sat beside her, subtly shifting so that she had a clear line of sight to Daniel's plate. Emma's hands felt ice-cold as she picked up her fork. She twirled some pasta onto it but didn't lift it to her mouth. Instead, she glanced at Daniel. "Aren't you going to try it?" she asked, her voice as casual as she could make it. Daniel gave her a small smile, picking up his fork. "Of course." For a moment, time seemed to slow. Emma held her breath as she watched him scoop up a bite of pasta and bring it to his mouth. Her heart pounded so hard she thought she might pass out. And then, the sound of the doorbell shattered the tension. Daniel froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. Emma nearly gasped in relief, barely managing to keep her expression neutral. "I'll get it," she said quickly, standing before he could protest. As she walked toward the door, she could feel his eyes on her back. She prayed he wouldn't follow. When she opened the door, she found Jake standing there, his expression concerned. She had texted him earlier, a desperate plea disguised as a casual request. "Can you stop by? Need to talk." Jake was one of Daniel's oldest friends, but he was also close to Emma. Over the years, he had become like a brother to her, someone she knew she could trust. "Hey," he said, glancing past her into the house. "Everything okay?" Emma didn't answer. Instead, she grabbed his wrist and pulled him inside, closing the door behind him. "I need your help," she whispered urgently. Jake's expression shifted instantly. "What's going on?" Emma took a shaky breath. "Daniel, he's trying to poison me." For a second, Jake just stared at her, as if trying to process what he had just heard. "What?" "I overheard him on the baby monitor. He said he mixed something into my food." Jake's jaw clenched. He looked toward the dining room, his hands curling into fists. "Okay," he said after a moment. "We need to get you out of here." Emma shook her head. "I can't just run. We need proof. We need to make sure he's the one who eats it." Jake exhaled sharply. "And what if he doesn't?" Emma met his eyes. "Then we need to find another way." Before Jake could respond, Daniel's voice called out from the dining room. "Emma, everything okay?" She forced herself to sound normal. "Yeah. Jake just stopped by. He needs to borrow something." There was a pause. Then, "Well, tell him to come in and have a drink." Emma exchanged a glance with Jake. He nodded slightly, his posture tense but controlled. They walked back into the dining room, where Daniel was watching them with a carefully neutral expression. His eyes flicked to Jake, then back to Emma. "Didn't know we were having company," Daniel said lightly. Jake smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Hope you don't mind." Daniel gestured to the wine bottle. "Not at all. Sit down. Have a drink." Jake sat at the table, his gaze flicking briefly to Daniel's plate. Emma knew he was taking in every detail, assessing the situation. "Actually," Jake said after a moment, "I'm starving. Mind if I grab a plate?" Emma's stomach twisted. He was improvising, trying to force Daniel's hand. Daniel hesitated. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Emma saw it. "Of course," Daniel said smoothly. "Let me get you one." He stood and walked to the kitchen. The moment he was out of earshot, Jake turned to Emma and Claire. "Switch his plate now." Emma didn't hesitate. She and Claire quickly swapped Daniel's plate with another one, making sure the poisoned food would end up in front of him. A moment later, Daniel returned, carrying an extra plate for Jake. As he sat back down, Emma's pulse raced. It was only a matter of time now. Emma's hands trembled under the table, her pulse hammering in her ears as she watched Daniel settle back into his seat. The air in the dining room felt thick, suffocating, as if the walls were closing in. Claire sat stiffly beside her, her fingers curled tightly around her fork, while Jake, ever the master of composure, leaned back in his chair, seemingly relaxed but with sharp eyes trained on Daniel. The plates sat before them untouched. The only sound was the faint ticking of the wall clock and the occasional clink of silverware as they pretended to engage in a normal dinner. Emma could feel Daniel watching her, waiting, and she forced herself to pick up her fork. "Long day?" she asked, feigning casual interest. Her voice sounded too bright, too forced, but she prayed he wouldn't notice. Daniel gave her a small smile, but there was something unreadable in his eyes. "You could say that." He twirled his fork through the pasta, lifting a bite toward his mouth. Emma held her breath. And then he hesitated. It was barely a fraction of a second, but she saw it. His eyes flicked down to the plate, then back up at her. The room suddenly felt even colder. Jake, quick on his feet, let out a laugh, drawing attention away from the brief pause. "Man, I didn't realize how hungry I was. Claire, you really outdid yourself." He dug into his food with exaggerated enthusiasm, making a show of chewing. Emma knew exactly what he was doing, trying to disarm Daniel, to make it seem like everything was normal. Daniel chuckled, relaxing slightly. "Glad you think so." And then, slowly, deliberately, he picked up his own fork again. Emma's stomach twisted into knots as she watched him scoop up a bite and place it into his mouth. A breath she hadn't realized she was holding slipped out. But she wasn't safe yet. She needed to see him swallow. Daniel chewed, his expression unreadable. Then he swallowed. Emma felt the blood drain from her face. This was it. She waited, her heart slamming against her ribs. Any second now, the effects should start. She had no idea what kind of poison he had used. Was it immediate? Would it take a few minutes? Would he start feeling dizzy? Would his throat close up? But nothing happened. Daniel took another bite. Emma's fingers tightened around her fork. This wasn't right. If the food had been poisoned, he should be reacting by now. But he wasn't. And then something even worse occurred to her. What if he knew? What if he had anticipated that she would switch the plates? What if he had poisoned more than one? Or worse, what if he had never poisoned the food at all, and this was just some twisted mind game? Panic threatened to consume her, but she couldn't afford to let it show. She needed a new plan. "Wine?" she offered, reaching for the bottle. Her hands shook as she poured a glass for herself, then one for Daniel. He smiled. "Thanks." She watched as he lifted the glass to his lips and took a sip. Maybe, just maybe, it had been in the wine instead. But again, nothing happened. Emma felt sick. Daniel had always been intelligent, methodical. If he had really planned to poison her, he would have been careful. He would have covered all his tracks. Had she underestimated him? Claire cleared her throat, forcing a smile. "So, Jake, how's work?" Jake picked up on her attempt to keep the conversation flowing. "Busy as hell. Had a case last week that nearly drove me insane." Daniel leaned back slightly. "That's so." Emma barely heard the conversation. Her mind was spinning, trying to piece together what had gone wrong. Had she misheard him on the baby monitor? No, she was certain of what she had heard. Then why was he fine? Her stomach twisted. She couldn't sit here any longer. She needed to get out, to breathe, to think. "I need to grab something from the kitchen," she said suddenly, pushing back her chair. Daniel's gaze flicked to her. "Everything okay?" She forced a smile. "Yeah, just need to check on something." Before he could question her further, she turned and walked toward the kitchen, her legs shaky beneath her. The moment she was out of sight, she pressed a hand to the counter, trying to steady herself. Something wasn't right. She needed to get to his office. The baby monitor had picked up his conversation, which meant he had been speaking near it. If he had been planning something, there might still be evidence up there. Glancing back toward the dining room, she saw Claire and Jake still engaging Daniel in conversation. He didn't seem suspicious. This was her chance. Moving quickly, she slipped out of the kitchen and toward the stairs. Her heart pounded with every step. If Daniel caught her, she had no idea what he would do. She reached his office and pushed the door open, stepping inside. The room smelled faintly of his cologne, a scent that now made her nauseous. She scanned the desk, papers, his laptop, a glass of water. Nothing immediately suspicious. Then she saw his phone. It was face down, but still unlocked. She picked it up, her breath catching as she swiped to his recent calls. Her stomach dropped. The last call was to a number she didn't recognize. But it wasn't just the number that made her blood run cold, it was the timestamp. He had made the call after she had heard him on the monitor. Emma's blood turned to ice. That meant one thing. He had wanted her to hear him. Her hands shook as she scrolled through his messages, her heart hammering louder with each passing second. And then she saw it. A message sent just an hour ago. She knows, Plan B. The air left her lungs. It was a trap. She turned, heart slamming against her ribs, but the moment she stepped toward the door, she froze. Daniel was standing in the doorway. His dark eyes locked onto hers, and for the first time she saw it, the cold calculation beneath his carefully constructed mask. He smiled. "You shouldn't have come up here, Emma." The room suddenly felt unbearably small, the walls pressing in on her. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she took a shaky step back. Daniel tilted his head, watching her like a predator sizing up its prey. "You thought you were being clever, didn't you?" he mused, switching the plates, calling Jake, "thinking you could outsmart me." Emma's throat went dry. "Why?" she whispered. "Why are you doing this?" His expression didn't change. "Because I don't have a choice." Her heart pounded. "There's always a choice." Daniel sighed, as if disappointed. "Not this time?" And then he stepped forward, closing the door behind him. Emma's breath caught in her throat as Daniel shut the door behind him, the soft click of the latch sounding louder than a gunshot in the silence. He stood there, blocking the only exit, his posture unnervingly relaxed. But his eyes, those dark, calculating eyes, held something far more dangerous than anger. He had planned for this. Her mind raced through the possible ways out. If she screamed, Claire and Jake would hear her. But would they make it in time? If she ran, he was faster, stronger. She needed to stall. Emma forced herself to stand tall, swallowing the fear clawing at her throat. "You knew," she said, her voice only slightly unsteady. "You wanted me to hear you on the monitor." Daniel's lips curved into a slow smile. "Took you long enough to figure it out." She clenched her fists. "Why? What's the endgame here?" Daniel exhaled, as if speaking to a child who just didn't understand. "Because, Emma, you were never supposed to see what was coming. But once you did, I had to adapt." He took a slow step forward, and she instinctively stepped back, her shoulders brushing against his desk. "You think you caught me, but I caught you, the second you started acting differently." Emma's mind flashed back to dinner, to the way he had hesitated before taking a bite. He knew then. "Is the food poisoned?" she asked, needing to hear him confirm it. Daniel chuckled. "Of course not. Do you really think I'd risk leaving evidence like that?" His smile widened slightly. "You were supposed to believe it was, though. I needed to see how you'd react, and you played your part beautifully." Emma's stomach turned. It had never been about the food. It had been a test. Her fingers twitched at her sides, itching for anything she could use as a weapon. She glanced at the desk, but Daniel noticed and shook his head. "Don't," he warned. Her pulse pounded. What was Plan B, she demanded. Daniel tilted his head. "You're standing in it." A chill ran through her. This room, this moment, this was the trap. She swallowed hard, trying to think. Claire and Jake were downstairs. If she could just keep Daniel talking, if she could just make him slip. She squared her shoulders. "You said you didn't have a choice." Something flickered in his expression, just for a second. He ran a hand through his hair, sighing. "I didn't." Emma saw an opening. "Then explain it to me." Daniel hesitated. For the first time, he actually hesitated. She pressed. "If you're so sure of yourself, if you think you've already won, Then tell me why. A muscle in his jaw tightened. Then, finally, he spoke. I owe people money, Emma. She blinked. What? Not the kind of debt you pay off with a credit card. His voice was edged with something unfamiliar. Regret? I made some bad investments, tried to fix it, but I went to the wrong people. Emma's stomach twisted. She had known Daniel handled most of their finances, but she had never questioned it, had never needed to. How much? She whispered. Daniel's lips pressed into a thin line. Enough that they gave me two choices: pay them back or give them something worth more. Emma felt like she was drowning, and that something was me? Daniel didn't answer. He didn't have to. Her vision blurred for a second. Her own husband had decided that the solution to his problems was her death. She swallowed the bile rising in her throat. And what? My accidental death pays them off? Daniel nodded, almost casually. Your life insurance payout covers the debt. I walk away clean. A bitter laugh bubbled in her chest. You thought you could actually get away with it? Daniel's gaze darkened. I would have, if you hadn't started digging. The room felt like it was spinning. He had been planning this for weeks, maybe longer. The husband she thought she knew had been preparing to kill her, cash in, and move on. Emma tightened her fists. No, she wasn't going to die here. Footsteps sounded downstairs. Daniel's head turned slightly toward the noise. Jake and Claire. Emma seized her chance. She lunged, grabbing the nearest object, a heavy paperweight from the desk, and swung it with all her strength. The impact was solid. Daniel staggered back, cursing, his hand flying to the side of his head where she had hit him. Blood trickled from the wound. Emma bolted. She yanked the door open and ran down the stairs 2 at a time, her breath ragged. "Help!" she screamed. Jake was the first to react. He shot up from his chair, eyes locking onto her, just as Daniel came barreling down behind her. In an instant, Jake stepped between them. "Back off, man." Daniel wiped the blood from his face, glaring. "Stay out of this, Jake." Claire grabbed Emma's arm, pulling her back. "What the hell is going on?" Emma was shaking. He was going to kill me. He set this all up. The debt, the insurance, everything." Jake's expression darkened. "You serious?" Daniel let out a short laugh. "Come on, you really think she's telling the truth?" Emma's hands clenched. "Check his phone." Jake didn't hesitate. He reached for Daniel's pocket, but Daniel jerked away. "Don't touch me!" That was all the confirmation they needed. Jake tackled him. The two men crashed to the floor, knocking over a chair. Claire grabbed Emma, pulling her back. "Call the cops." Emma fumbled for her phone, her fingers barely working as she dialed 911. Jake had the upper hand, pinning Daniel to the ground. "You sick son of a—" Daniel thrashed, but Jake was stronger. "You don't understand." "Like hell I don't," Jake snapped. "You were going to murder your wife." Emma's voice shook as she spoke into the phone. "My husband. He tried to kill me. I need help. Please." The operator responded, asking for details, but Emma could barely process it. Claire took the phone from her, giving their address, her own voice shaking. Daniel went still beneath Jake. He wasn't struggling anymore, just breathing heavily, staring up at the ceiling. He stepped closer, her fists still clenched. "Was it ever real?" she asked quietly. "Us?" Daniel didn't look at her. The sound of sirens pierced the night air. Within minutes, the house was swarmed with flashing red and blue lights. Officers stormed in, pulling Daniel up and restraining him. He didn't resist. As they led him away, he finally met her eyes. "No," he said simply. "It wasn't." Emma's heart shattered. But she was alive, and that was enough.